enforcement, the United States Congress, the DOD, and any other necessary bodies. Funding, none needed. Timeline, immediately upon an affirmative ballot. Since we're running a comparative advantage case, meaning if the affirmative team's advantages outweigh the disadvantages, they best deserve your ballot. The advantages to our plan are important, which leads us to our advantage one, reduce recidivism. Recidivism is an important part to see how well our prisons are doing. If it's for families or inmates to inmates, help lower recidivism by a big amount. According to Peter Wagner and Bernadette Roberts in January 2015, quote, family contact is one of the surest ways to reduce the likelihood that an individual will reoffend after release. The technical term for which is recidivism. A rigorous study by the Minnesota Department of Corrections found that even a single visit reduced recidivism by 13% for new crimes and 25% for technical violations, or contact between incarcerated and people and their loved ones. End quote. Family contact for prisoners helps lower recidivism, but besides reduce recidivism, family visits have even been proved to bring up employment rates from inmates. We see this in advantage too. Family visits increase jobs after prison. Family visits increase jobs after prison. Family visits don't just lower prisoners' rates of returning to prison, but it also helps them to get a job after they get out of prison. Ian Brunton Smith and Daniel J. McCarthy say, quote, prisoners that experience improved family relations are significantly less likely to reoffend, whilst also being more likely to find work and desist from Class A drug use. Later in the article, they say, looking beyond reoffending allows us to paint a more detailed picture. The role of family contact on resettlement, whilst also ensuring our results are not too reliant on offending data. Family visits aren't just proven to affect after-prison behavior, but they've even been shown to help inmates during incarceration. We see this in our last and final, Advantage 3. Family visits increase good behavior. Family visits increase good behavior. Visits aren't just important after prison. We see this from a piece of evidence from Thomas Dutcher, who reports a study done by Sandvik Mears. He says, quote, the results of this study show that gaps in visitation may increase inmate infractions and violence. The authors find that maintaining and facilitating regular visits reduces infractions and violence, end quote. Instead of allowing the flawed current system to continue, we urge an affirmative ballot to allow isolated prisoners to have visitation from families. Thank you, and I'm now open for cross-examination.
All right. I have 3 minutes on this clock. If you're ready, I'll go ahead and start. That was a great speech. I've just got a couple of questions. So just to clarify, who does not have family visitation?
Solitary confinement.
Right. So what would you say is a definition? Like, what is your definition of solitary confinement?
The state of being kept alone from other prisoners.
Right. So what is the Bureau of Prisons, or what does the government define solitary confinement as?
I don't think they've posted their definition on what that is.
Does the government acknowledge that solitary confinement exists?
Of course.
So the government, do you have any evidence saying the government says solitary confinement exists?
No, we don't. I think that's kind of basic.
Okay, interesting. Would you say that in order to implement your policy, in order to, for example, monitor these meetings, you would need more staff?
I don't think so.
Why not?
You could just hire the guards to stay longer.
Right, but you'd agree that that takes more staff, or at least it requires greater hours from the current staff.
Sure.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about SHUs. Does your plan only affect SHUs?
Yes.
All right. So there can be family visitation in SHUs, but not other forms of solitary confinement.
Yes, correct.
All right. So would you say that there's any kind of security risk? Does your plan monitor these family meetings that happen with people in solitary confinement?
Whatever's in the general population prison, that's what's going to be implemented here.
What do you mean is in the general population?
As in the general population prisons, as in anyone who's
Right.
in the normal.
Do you think there's a reason why these people are in solitary confinement?
We actually have evidence on that.
So would you, at the top of your head, would you say there's a reason that these people are in solitary confinement?
Well, the majority of people put in are put in solitary confinement are not for a major cause.
So you're saying that people are just put in solitary confinement for no good reason at all?
Most of them are, yes.
Do you have any evidence for that?
Yes, we can pass it to you.
All right, so just to clarify, these people that are in solitary confinement, are they monitored at all? Like their conversations?
I'm pretty sure so, yes.
All right, so you you said they are monitored.
Yes.
So in the general public, are they monitored?
Yes, if they're in the general public, then they should be for SHUs.
Right, but my question was, are they monitored in the general public?
Yes.
All right, that's great. That's all the questions I have. Thank you so much for answering them.
If you see a copy, you're going to see that also be amazing.
All right, we're going to go ahead and start prep time, starting at 5 minutes. No further prep time is needed. We have 4 minutes and 47 seconds.
Alright, let's grab my papers on the front here. I have an 8-minute speech, if you can see that right. And if the affirmative team is ready, and my judge, I'll go ahead and start. The affirmative team presented a policy to stop problems in one of the most problem-filled areas of government policy, the criminal justice system. In today's speech, I'm going to be going through 4 major facts of the solitary confinement system, and before impacting those into 4 major impacts of how it affects the ground. First, we're going to be talking about the types of solitary confinement and how the affirmative team actually affects them, before moving on to how the government doesn't track people in solitary confinement, before moving on and talking about how solitary confinement is used as the last step as a disciplinary measure, and finally talking about the need for staff. Let's go ahead and jump right in. That first argument you can simply write down as types of special housing. Once again, types of special housing. As clarified in the first speech of the affirmative as well as in cross-examination, the affirmative team is going to be affecting people under the government term of special housing units. So I'm going to be going through, there's actually 3 different types of solitary confinement, and I'm going to be going over what happens in those different solitary confinement units. According to Natasha Frost and Carlos Monterio, who's a PhD, he wrote in 2016 that, quote, inmates are placed in special housing units are in either administrative detention or disciplinary segregation. Administrative detention is intended to be temporary and non-punitive. Disciplinary segregation is the possible sanction for inmates who violate the rules. Lengths of stay is based on severity of the offense, end quote. So that right there is explaining specifically what special housing units are for. They go on to list what they get access to. And it says that specifically that they, quote, they get minimum 1 completed call per month and minimum 4 hours of visitation per month, end quote. That's right. The very people that the affirmative team affect in SHUs, in fact, get 1 hour of call per month and 4 hours of family visitation per month. It's not like they're not getting visitation at all. People under special housing units actually do. The people that don't get the family visitation are people in the classification of administrative maximum, who the affirmative team clarified they do not affect. This was clarified in cross-examination. They're not affecting people in other terms of solitary confinement, only people in special housing units who, as the evidence states, have access to family visitation. And just to clear this up, just so this doesn't have an issue in the background, I'll point you to the definition that the affirmative team provided in their first speech, where they say that, quote, since the federal term for solitary confinement is special housing units, we'll be using SHU for short to mean solitary confinement, end quote. So they're affecting people in SHU. Let's go ahead and address my second fact, which you can write down as the government doesn't track. Once again, the government doesn't track people in solitary confinement. And this comes from the Office of the Inspector General, published in July 2017 in the United States Department of Justice, where he said that, quote, since the Bureau of Prisons does not specifically track inmates placed in single cell confinement, Bureau of Prisons officials cannot easily identify inmates celled alone or ascertain the duration of such punishment, and consequently cannot intervene when single cell confinement may not be necessary, end quote. So the government doesn't even track people who are inside solitary confinement, and yet the affirmative team is passing a policy to give them family visitation. This is going to require more of just handing them that. It's going to require a mandate to identify who is actually in solitary confinement. The next fact you can simply write down as used as a last, before I move on, I'd like to read one more piece of evidence talking about that issue. The next piece of evidence comes, once again, from the Office of the Inspector General, where they say that, quote, Bureau of Prisons and department policies do not specifically recognize the term solitary confinement, end quote. So as we see, the Bureau of Prisons even actually denies the existence of solitary confinement, meaning that you're going to need some kind of major enforcement to enforce an agency that denies that it even exists to pass this policy. They go on to say, and this is another article from The Atlantic, where it says that, quote, at a hearing of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, Charles Samuels, the director of the Bureau of Prisons, denied that the Federal Bureau of Prisons even practices solitary confinement. He says that, quote, we do not practice solitary confinement, end quote. So the Bureau of Prisons, the very agency that they're affecting, denies that solitary confinement exists, and under the definition special housing units, they give people 4 hours of visitation every month, and they're placed in double bunk cells, meaning 2 people or more. Those 3 facts out of the way, that leads me into my impacts. The first impact, you can write down as special housing units have family visitation. Once again, special housing units have family visitation. As the evidence states, they get 1 hour of calls and 4 hours of visitation every single month under the category special housing units. The category that the deferred team might have wanted to affect, administrative detention, they don't even affect that under their plan, as clarified. The second impact you can write down as can't change. Once again, can't change. Number 1, they do not specifically track who is in solitary confinement. Meaning, even if you were able to give these people more family visitation time, they don't even track who even is in solitary confinement. The third impact you can write down as disciplinary measure consequence. Once again, disciplinary measure consequence. It's used as a last step for disciplinary violations, violence inside the prison. This is actually a punishment for the prisoner. So if we're just handing prisoners free family visitation time after they've violated prison rules, this denies the entire principle of justice. These prisoners are placed in this type of housing. Why? Because they violated prison rules, and they're placed in there for a temporary time. It's used as a last measure, and we defeat the entire purpose of a punishment if we just hand them all the benefits. Impact 4, you can specifically write down as already has. Once again, already has. As specified, special housing units already have minimum 4 hours of visitation every single month. The fifth impact you can write down, so my part's me talking about, is staffing issues. Once again, staffing issues. Now, as talked about in cross-examination, they said that there's going to be people that are needed to specifically monitor all these interactions, monitor the visitation, etc. And my opponent, Henry, he specifically mentioned that, well, you could pay guards to work extra hours to monitor. If you look at their mandate, they never specify we are paying guards for extra hours to even do this. So at the end of the day, they don't even specify how they're going to be monitored. They just say, hand them free family visitation, and guess what this does? What this does, this means that either A, there's double blind. Either A, you have entirely unmonitored family visitation where basically anything could happen, or you have the opposite of that, where you just don't have any family visitation because there's no staff allocated or any funding to be specific. So at the end of the day, we've seen that first. The very thing that the affirmative affects does in fact have family visitation. This isn't like a large harm in the status quo. The second factor we saw is that the government doesn't track it. Number 1, the government doesn't track it. Number 2, the government denies it exists. Third, we saw it's used as a last step. It's a disciplinary measure the government has, not something that is used arbitrarily. The first impact we saw is that, once again, they do in fact have family visitation. We saw that they can't change it because if they deny it exists, if they aren't tracking it, how can you hand people that are unknown these family visitation? We saw in impact 3 that it's used as a consequence. You can't hand people free benefits if they're under a punishment. Finally, we saw there are large staff issues. There's no dedicated funding and there's no dedicated staff to monitor these visits. At the end of the day, I ask you to vote for a responsible policy. I don't want you to make more problems in an already problem-filled area. And that's why I ask you to vote negative.
Is my opponent ready?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Judge. I'll begin. Hey, Mr. Aryani, I just have a couple of questions for you. So, first off, could I see the evidence how the government doesn't track it?
Sure. I read a couple, so you want evidence also about how they deny it exists or?
Sure.
Okay. You can ask me a question.
Okay, and then you'd agree that BOP has admitted that visits are in place through law, correct?
How admitted that what?
Visits are in place through law, correct?
Visits are in place through law. I'm not sure. I haven't seen it.
For the regular population.
They've admitted that it exists both in solitary confinement and it also exists for normal.
Okay. Do you mind if I pass it?
Yeah, sure.
And then, you'd agree that rights ought to be upheld, right?
Rights ought to be upheld. I believe that typically most rights should be upheld, but if you were affecting like the most severe type of solitary confinement, I don't think you should hand free benefits to people that are violating prison rules. They're committing violence in prisons. I don't think you should be handing them free benefits when they are explicitly
Okay,
violating.
do you have evidence on them violating the prison rules?
So the evidence I said is that it is specifically used only for violations. People that
Can I
violate.
see that piece of evidence?
Sure. It's under this, and it's specific. This evidence also talks about how they already have access to this.
Okay, thank you. Can I pass it back?
Go ahead.
So then you'd agree that allowing visits for inmates in SAU is just a law in place, right?
It's just a long place. From all the evidence in today's debate round, they do in fact have access to it. If they're not getting it, that just leads you back to my other point, where if the government doesn't track it, then how on earth are you going to give it to them?
Okay, we can talk about that in later speeches. You'd agree that recidivism is important, correct?
People recommitting crimes is important. I
But
said
that measure is important.
keeping it. Yes, I would agree that keeping that number down is very important.
Okay, you'd agree that family ties are also important to uphold your prisoner.
I agree that family ties are important, but when it comes in conflict with justice and a criminal justice system, I think justice ought to be first upheld.
Okay, but don't you think that good activity from prisoners is good, right?
Good activity from prisoners is good. Yes.
Okay, so don't you think it would be good to implement? Never mind. You'd agree that employment is important for prisoners, correct?
Yeah, in some cases, but whenever we see people that are committing violence in prisons and doing all that stuff and placed in double bunk cells and stuff like that, I don't think that we should, consider all the risks here. I don't think we should allow those people access to labor services.
Okay, you'd agree that helping prisoners after prison is important, right?
You mean like post conviction services?
After they come out of jail, do you think it's important to help them?
Yeah, I do think that's very important.
Okay, so don't you think that it would be good for us to pass this plan? Because if we pass this plan, then we're allowing all these good things to happen for the prisoners, and so.
I think you cause very large staffing issues, very large justice issues, as well as very large risks of violence, and so I don't think it's a good idea. Your goal is good, and I agree that it's a noble cause, but at the end of the day, the policy isn't well implemented or even implemented at all.
Okay, thank you. I have no further time.
Thank you so much for your questions.
The affirmative will be taken care of. If we continue, we have 4 minutes. Quote, some people may scoff at these ideas under the view that criminals shouldn't have an easy time seeing their friends and family. Many people believe that, after all, prisoners are supposed to be punished for their crimes. The point of criminal justice system is to keep us safe, and taking research-backed steps to prevent inmates from reoffending achieves that goal. End quote. This piece of evidence from German Lopez on October 22, 2015 is basically talking about when we take these ideas that are already proven, that knows that it actually helps reoffending, it's a good idea, and we should take these research-based goals. Now, in this speech, I'm going to be responding to my opponent's last speech and then bringing up a couple of advocacy points and also some advantages. Now, first, they talk about how the different types of SAU and basically how there are visits. However, I would like to point out that their piece of evidence is from 2016. And I have a piece of evidence from 2020 talking about how the
the BOP does not allow, does not allow people in SHU to receive visitors. In fact, there are people advocating that this plan should be passed. There are people saying that the people in SHU should be allowed family visits. This is from Michelle Weehoff on June 12, 2020. Quote, each solitary unit should appoint a family liaison who informs families when their loved one is sent to segregation, updates them on their condition, and seeks input about treatments needed. People in solitary should be allowed regular visits and calls to maintain family connections. The frequency and duration of visits should be extended, contact visits should be permitted, especially with children, and people should be allowed to remove shackles during non-contact visits, end quote. So basically what she's saying is that when people are visiting, when people are in solitary, they deserve the visits that people in general population prisons get. And clearly, visits aren't allowed, or else she wouldn't be advocating for that idea. Now, next they brought up how the government doesn't track people in solitary confinement, and I would like to respond to this in 2 points. The first is that they talk in the piece of evidence is talking about how if we remove solitary confinement, we can't remove it because we don't really know about it. They say it may not be necessary to intervene and change the solitary confinement cells. However, I'd like to point out that we're not trying to remove solitary confinement. We're keeping solitary confinement. We're using solitary confinement. We're not removing. All we're doing is enhancing them. Through our family visits, we're decreasing the bad behavior. We are allowing these prisoners a second chance to be better, to have better behavior. And so we are enhancing the use of solitary confinement and making solitary confinement even better by decreasing their bad behavior by more. Now, I'd also like to respond to his next point, which is that the BOP does not use solitary confinement. First, I'd like to use his own piece of evidence against him. In the piece of evidence, it says, although the BOP states that it does not practice solitary confinement or even recognize the term, we found inmates, including those with mental illness, who were housed in single-celled confinement periods for a long time, isolated from other inmates with limited human contact. This is from their own piece of evidence. It says, although the BOP says it doesn't, we found that they do. So clearly, their own piece of evidence says that there is solitary confinement. Their own piece of evidence says that the BOP does use solitary confinement. But I'd also like to respond to this with the second thing is that the United Nations also finds that the BOP is faking their use of solitary confinement. The BOP pretends it doesn't, but it actually does. This is from Survedi Nyambara, and she says on December 5th, 2014, quote, both in the periodic reports during the hearings, the United States government sought to assure the Committee on Torture that sufficient restrictions on the imposition of solitary confinement are already in place. But the United Nations Committee reaffirms that it remains concerned about reports extensive use of solitary confinement and other forms of isolation in U.S. prisons, even as the United States denies any systematic use. Quote. So what this piece of evidence is saying is that the BOP denies, but that's because they don't want the United Nations to think they do. But the United Nations still sees that they are using solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is being used. Now, he also brought up a few other impacts, which I is basically responded to in my speech. Talked about how the SHU does have visits and discipline is and it's already classed. And basically, I responded to that. He also talked about how the SHU units were double bunked. I'd like to respond to this by saying they are not, and this is you can respond to this. You can check this as SHU is solitary. SHU is solitary. This is from the Office of Inspector General in the U.S. Department of Justice, and he says on July 2017, quote, inmates did not engage in recreation with each other and other inmates and were confined to their cells for over 22 hours a day. Also, in 5 SHUs, we observed single-celled inmates. One inmate who we were told was denied ADX placement for mental health reasons and has been single-celled for 4 years. So there are SHU units that are single-celled. They're not all double bunked. Now, at this point, I'd like to now talk about the advocacy and how our plan isn't just something we are advocating for. It's also something that everyone else wants too. We're not the only ones that thinks this is a great idea. As you see through my speech, there are no real problems. There are no disadvantages they didn't bring up, and our advantages do stand. But the United Nations also agrees that these family visits are important. They endorse the use of family visits to solitary confinement inmates. Sharon Shalev said on January 1st, 2022, quote, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture endorsed these recommendations, added that regardless of the specific circumstances of its use, the effort is required to raise the level of social contact for prisoners, allowing access to social activities with other prisoners, allowing more visits, and providing access to mental health services. So the United Nations agrees it's a good idea to add these family visits. So we believe that as the affirmative team, since we do have the United Nations advocating for us, and there are really no problems, we urge an affirmative ballot. And now, I'm now.
All right, let me just grab it. I have 3-minute cross-examination. My name is Rick. And Eric. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. First off, you specifically talked about how solitary confinement actually doesn't have visitation. Could I ask the evidence that you quoted from right there?
Could you repeat that one?
You basically just said that these special housing units don't actually have access to family visitation.
Yes, it was, here, you can ask the next question.
Okay, and under that point, the evidence you put in your 1AC, would you agree that that evidence specifically talking about COVID-19 isolation and quarantine units?
No, I do not believe, because they separate isolation and quarantine. They would have just said quarantine units.
Okay, would you agree that the specific citation for that article comes from their COVID-19 policy section of the
I do
website?
believe, but in the COVID-19 policies, they were talking about social visits.
Okay, do you have any evidence saying that from before COVID-19 specific policies, visitation was not allowed?
I do not have any evidence of that, but I don't believe that really is important to this round.
Okay, so you're saying that the only evidence you have saying that family visitation does not exist is only from a specific citation coming from COVID-19 related policies?
No, we have other evidence in the back of the table talking about how the SHU units are never allowed.
Okay, if we could see those pieces of evidence, or maybe could you send them back to the table, that would be wonderful. Next, you specifically talked about how the evidence that we had specifically stated it was a claim. You would agree that my point under there was simply that the Bureau of Prisons claims it doesn't exist, not that it doesn't.
Yes, I
Okay.
do agree.
Yeah, I'm glad we can agree on that. And if your enforcement, let's say the Bureau of Prisons is the one enacting the plan or actually doing this stuff, right?
They were one of the mentioned.
Right, but if this is affecting the Bureau of Prison cells, the Bureau of Prisons is obviously going to be doing the enforcement, correct?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so if the Bureau of Prisons denies that solitary confinement exists, if they claim it doesn't exist, how are you going to mandate that they themselves?
Exactly. So in our 1AC, we do say SHU units. We don't say solitary confinement. That's why we defined it, and we said SHU units, which we will call solitary.
And do any of the evidence that you have specifically talking about how they don't have visitation specifically refer to SHUs?
Yes, we do have evidence. I can show you that.
Okay, if you could send it back to the table as well, that would be wonderful. Next, you specifically talked about how SHUs are single cell, most of the time they're single cell. You would agree that first that piece of evidence was referring to 5 specific examples, correct?
Yes, but I don't believe they were going to go and look at each
Right.
and every single.
And so, and the one that it actually cited was specifically not an ADX only because of mental health reasons, correct?
I do not believe I would be hearing that.
Okay, and I would love to see that piece of evidence. And do you have any other piece of evidence talking about just normal, non-mental health related solitary confinement cases, just entirely normal solitary confinement SHU cases where the person is double locked, or is single locked?
I believe I already gave it to you. I think it's on the piece of evidence that I just gave.
Okay, evidence saying that these people are single bunked in just normal cases?
Yes.
Okay, and
I believe it said mental health and it said normal cases as well.
okay, it looks like I'm just about out of time. If you guys could send those pieces of evidence over, that would be wonderful. We'll take prep time away for that evidence. We have 4:47. Starting that now.
1/3 of federal correctional officer jobs in the United States are vacant, forcing prisons to use cooks, teachers, nurses, and other workers to guard inmates. Fights are breaking out. Several inmates have escaped in recent months, and in Illinois, one of the most understaffed prisons in the industry, 5 inmates have died in homicides or suicides since March 2020. The staffing crisis is reaching a breaking point, and the pandemic hasn't helped. Nearly 7,000 employees were also sickened with COVID, unquote. This piece of evidence from the Associated Press on March 21st of 2021 perfectly pictures the current situation in a federal grove of prisons, federal prisons. I think one thing we can all agree on, and this was asked in cross-examination as well, is that adding new monitoring, adding more visitation would require more staff. Whether it be hiring more staff or adding staff and giving them more hours, one thing is certain, staff will be required, and with the affirmative team, more staff will be required, whether it be the same staff working longer hours or hiring new staff. In today's speech, I'm going to be doing 2 things. First, I'm going to go ahead and show you one main harm or disadvantage to the affirmative team in that of staffing shortages, and why staffing shortages is applicable to the affirmative team, and why staffing shortages is bad for the criminal justice system and for prisoners and prisons themselves. Before I go ahead and respond and basically extend onto one main argument, to clarify, my partner will be responding to all the arguments you heard in the last speech in his next rebuttal. Let's go ahead and go into this argument. You can tag it as their reform requires staff. Now, this is not just my own words. This is the Associated Press, the same article I just quoted from 2021. It says, quote, "You can't do programming, you can't have safety, you can't have a lot of things that make prisons operate without proper staffing," unquote. This evidence is clear. The affirmative team, of course, their plan requires more staffing. But why is staffing bad? Well, you already heard that piece of evidence that I talked about a little bit, or the critical staffing shortage. Right now, in the rural prison, there is a critical staffing shortage. 33% of jobs are vacant. And what did that evidence say that I read at the beginning of my speech? It said that fights are breaking out, and they're using staff, like, for example, teachers, cooks, nurses, and other workers to guard inmates, to monitor inmates. Now, this all comes to head in an impact. Of course, there's a staffing shortage, but why is this important? Well, first, you can write my first impact down as increased violence. Low staffing numbers elevates risk of riots and violence. Low staffing numbers elevates risk of riots and violence. This is from Keaton Ross. She's a reporter for the American Corps Member, and she published this on June 21st, 2021. She said, State Representative Justin Humphrey issued a press release calling for a state of emergency to be declared in state prisons, arguing that low staffing numbers have elevated the risk of riots and violence. If there's nobody watching, inmates start policing themselves. Humphrey, who worked for the Department of Corrections for 20 years representing public office, said, and here, unquote, "Staffing shortage is so severe in some places that inmates have to monitor themselves. Do you think adding more staff or extending their hours or putting them in other places to make sure that these people are having safe more family visits, would that actually do anything? Is that really the best way to do it, to implement a policy when we already have this staffing shortage right now that is causing inmates to police themselves? I hope not. But that's not all. There's a second subpoint. Low staffing forces deployment of unqualified employees staffing forces deployment of unqualified employees as correctional officers, which increases risk, or simply unqualified employees. This is from Kevin Johnson. He's a Justice Department correspondent for USA Today. He said this in December 9th of 2020. He said, quote, "USA Today reported that hundreds of secretaries, teachers, counselors, cooks, and medical staffers were tapped to fill guard posts throughout the system because of an insufficient number of officers. The moves are being made despite repeated warning that the assignments placed unprepared employees at risk. And the practice has continued for years, even though the agency has been rebuked by Congress and federal labor arbitrators," unquote. The problem is clear. If you vote affirmative, you will be requiring more staff. Now, of course, there's a whole contentious issue of whether or not this is already happening or not, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. But if you believe the affirmative team and believe it isn't happening, one thing is clear. If you increase staff, more violence will happen, more violence, more riots, more negative things in the prison system. But my second impact, jail breaks. So can write down my second impact as simply as jailbreaks. This is from Robbie McPartlin. He is a reporter at Illinois News Today. This is from June 11, 2021. He said, quote, 29 prisoners have fled the U.S. federal blockade in the last 18 months, and nearly half have not been yet captured. Personnel may not be aware that the prisoners have been missing for hours. In one Texas lockup, security is so loose that law enforcement officers are personally joking about the seemingly open door policy. All escapes occurred in federal prison camps with minimal security. This figure raised serious concerns that security authorities, long besieged by chronic mismanagement and serious staffing crises, are failing to perform the most basic function of keeping prisoners in prison. Unquote. Not only are there problems inside the prison, it's also about just monitoring these prisoners so they can't run away. All those stories you've heard about, the famous jailbreaks, well, there isn't even enough staff to make sure that these people aren't running away. If you vote affirmative, this reality that's happening right now will get so much worse. I hope you don't want more jailbreaks, more violence, and more riots. But that's not all. Let's go ahead and go into my second argument. That's simply of no need. It already exists. Now, the contention of the affirmative team supports that it already exists. But I would like to clarify. The one piece of evidence that they brought up that actually said that people in SHUs are barred from visitation, this was from Rita Palta, was from 2013. None of the other pieces of evidence that they have sent to us, it's not online, given to us or read in today's debate rounds, none of them have specifically said SHU. Except this one piece of evidence right in front of me. Guess when it's from? It's from 2013. We've already acknowledged that the affirmative team, or the negative team, brought up a piece of evidence from 2016, which was from the prisons themselves, Baroa Prisons website themselves, which had a graph that said that SHUs get minimum 4 hours a week of visitation. What does this mean? Why do we need the affirmative team's plan? If the affirmative team's plan is already in existence as of 2016, no newer evidence saying that it isn't, why do we need the affirmative team's plan? There is monitored visitation happening right now. There's no need to pass the affirmative team. The only thing you can do is absolutely nothing. In today's speech, we've looked at a couple of things. First, the radical need for staff. And the affirmative team, if you do believe it's not happening, will require more staff, which will cause a negative world. You'll have more jailbreaks, more violence, more riots, or it's not happening at all, which is what the negative team believes. You see, as of 2016, they are getting visitation. There is absolutely no need for the affirmative team. Thank you so much. Now it's time for cross-examination.
All right. Is the church ready? Hi, Cyrus. I just have a couple questions for you. First off, you talked about a lot about staff, and you would agree that all your points in your first point were relying on staff, correct?
No, my first point was simply the context of the situation.
Yes. So you would agree that most of it was talking about staff and the bad things that would happen without staff, correct?
No, the evidence was saying that right now we have a staffing shortage. 33% of the prison staffing is vacant, or excuse me, the 33% of the industry is vacant.
Okay, so you agree you were talking about staffing issues, correct?
Oh, of course, yes.
Okay, so you'd agree if there ever was a piece of evidence that says staff isn't an issue, then violence and jailbreaks wouldn't be an issue, correct?
If there was a piece of, you're saying if there was a piece of evidence that said staffing is not an issue, then, well, first of all, I'd have to look at that piece of evidence, and then even if there's such a piece of evidence existed, I have supreme doubts because I think staffing is very important.
We can talk about that later. You'd agree that we are running a comparative advantage case, correct?
Right, you are basically saying that our policy needs to provide advantages. It needs to be a good idea.
Yeah, you'd agree that comparative advantage just means the advantages have to outweigh the disadvantages,
Right,
correct?
you need to have more good than bad.
Okay, and did you bring up any disadvantages in your?
Yes, I just brought up a disadvantage, the whole staffing argument, that was all disadvantage. It was a harm to the affirmative.
Okay, so the staffing argument was a disadvantage.
Correct.
Okay.
I don't have to say this is a disadvantage, it can also be a disadvantage.
Yeah,
There's many of them.
I get it. So now you talked about how there's no need because this was already existed. Can I see the piece of evidence talking about the 2016?
Yes, it's a chart, right? Oh, I think I left it at the table.
Okay, that's fine.
We can send it back to you, because I know we kind of exchanged it.
Yeah, that's fine. And then can I see my piece of evidence back?
Yes.
get back to my next speech, because as soon as I'm done, I'll hand it to you. Just go ahead and get a timer for 5 minutes, and this is the first negative rebuttal of today's round. 5 minutes on the clock. If the affirmative team is ready, go ahead and get started. Today's speech, I'm going to be doing two main things. First, responding to all the lines of argumentation you heard from Eric, and then extending the arguments you heard from Cyrus. Let's go ahead and respond to the arguments you heard from Eric. The first argument he's talking about is how special housing units do not, in fact, have visitation hours. His argument was that they don't have visitation hours. A response you can tag as government allots visitation hours. Once again, government allots visitation hours. Yes, very creative, but this is what we'll be talking about. And before I get into any of the main pieces of argument, I want to go back to the evidence. What supports both sides? I'm going to be examining the affirmative team's evidence that supposedly supports their side, that there just isn't visitation, and then I'm going to be examining the evidence we have on the negative side, saying that in fact they are allowed visitation. So let's go ahead and go into the affirmative team's evidence. The evidence that was in their 1AC, and the only evidence that's more recent than our evidence, was from 2020, when it's updated in 2020, that is. And it specifically states that, quote, isolation and quarantine unions will not be afforded social visitation, end quote. The piece of evidence that is supposedly newer than ours, number one, doesn't say special housing units. It says isolation and quarantine units. And in fact comes from www.bureauofprisons.gov/coronavirus/COVID-19. From what it seems, and I haven't been able to see any more context other than what this evidence says, isolation and quarantine units, and in fact, the evidence even says, quote, the use of plexiglass, similar barriers, and physical distancing, end quote. This seems very much like COVID-19 policy. And even if it wasn't COVID-19 policy, it isn't even specific to special housing units. It just says isolation and quarantine units. That seems very much like somebody that might have COVID and is in isolation, not somebody in special housing units. And the other evidence my partner addressed, the evidence was from 2013, and it wasn't even specific. The evidence that we have, which is I'm going to be quoting next, is this is the evidence directly from the government, where it specifically states that, quote, minimum 4 hours of visitation per month, end quote. And not only does it say 4 hours per month, it specifies that these are, quote, special housing units, end quote. It even specifies all the legal jargon in there about what these units are, and it says that they do, in fact, have access to them. So let me put this in retrospective. There are two pieces of evidence that we've seen from the affirmative side, one from 2013 from a private organization, and one from the government in 2020 saying isolation and quarantine units don't have any visitation. The evidence on the negative side comes directly from the government in 2016 that states that they have 4 hours of visitation, and it is specific to special housing units. At the end of the day, it is clear. They do, in fact, have access to these units. Just because isolation and quarantine units don't COVID-19 doesn't mean they don't, in fact, have access. Let's move on to the flow. The next argument we talked about was the evidence that I read in my speech was about ending solitary confinement. I agree, the evidence was saying you can't end solitary confinement because the government didn't track. My point still stands. The evidence explicitly said the government does not track people in solitary confinement. It doesn't matter what the conclusion of the article was. The evidence stated that they don't specifically track people in solitary confinement. My argument still entirely stands. They didn't even respond to it. They just ignored the main crux of the argument and just said the evidence was talking about ending. The evidence said they don't track inmates in solitary confinement. And if that is the case, there is no solvency to the affirmative case. We don't know who they're affecting. We don't know how to get access to them. We don't even know who these prisoners are. The next argument he talked about was that there's single bunk. He basically said that there were 5, he read these evidence and said there's 5 cases of single bunking. And the evidence he actually, the one piece of evidence was number 1, he read the response down as 5 single housing units. Once again, 5 single housing units. The only evidence that we have at the end of the day that says that they're single bunks. The evidence on the negative side, once again, was talking in general that they are double bunks. And they have 5 different cases, just 5 cases where the people are single bunk. And that evidence actually said it was for mental health reasons. So we have 5 examples versus the general rule, and the general rule is double bunking. And the second piece of evidence that he had, that he actually sent back to me, was actually talking about the New York laws. And actually in the article, it says it's talking about New York correctional laws. We're not talking about state policy, we're talking about the federal government policy. Sure, maybe in New York they do have single bunking, but guess what? In the federal government, as my evidence says, special housing units are double bunked. And the final argument he talked about was talking about how the United Nations advocates for their plan. Sure, United Nations might advocate for it, the ACLU may advocate for it, it doesn't mean that there's a hole in the plan. They weren't advocating for the word-for-word plan, they were obviously advocating for implementation and such. You might have a good idea, and the UN might have a good idea, but in status quo number one, there's large staffing issues, so you can't even fix something like this. The government doesn't track it. And until you can fix those underlying issues, you can't fix the problem. Just because you have one advocate saying it's a good idea doesn't mean the plan with implementation is good. At the end of the day, I don't want to see riots in prison, and that's why I ask you.